By 19, she had borne 2 children for her own father. By 22, her brother had given her a third. On the Appalachian ridge, the lines between kinship and confinement blurred until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. The men lived under the same roof, slept under the same patched quilts, and passed her between them without a word. Neighbors claimed the children shared not only the same jawline, but the same slow, unblinking gaze, eyes too pale to belong wholly to this place. At dusk, the girl could be seen standing in the yard, not speaking, not moving, as if she were holding her breath, bracing for the next night. How had a single house become its own closed world? And what could keep it that way for so many years? If you're still watching, leave your mark by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. In the basement of the county courthouse, the air carried the weight of damp paper and coal ash. Records here were not arranged so much as left to find their own order, each box bearing the handwriting of a different decade. In the far corner, beneath a collapsed stack of land deeds, a folder without a label waited among the dust. Its cover was bent, the edges fretted from years of handling. Inside were 3 birth records, each cleanly typed on thin paper that had gone translucent with age. The mother's name was the same on all 3. On 2 of them, the father's name matched the household head, once written in a darker ink as if added after the rest. The margins on those pages were faintly erased, then written over in a hand too deliberate to be casual. No explanation accompanied the corrections. The date fields were neat, the attending officer's name consistent. The only difference was the place of birth, 2 at the family home, 1 at the county clinic. Later accounts described the home as set deep along the ridge beyond the Powers, and where the road gave way to clay and roots. No visitors recalled seeing glass in the windows. Curtains, if present, were nailed flat against the frame. The attending officer had left no other notes that year, and his absence from subsequent ledgers was unexplained. A clerk's recollection, written decades later, suggested that he had gone north for the climate. Those who had lived near the ridge in that period described an unease that was difficult to name. The woman from the records was seldom seen beyond the property's fence. Grocers remembered her ordering in bulk, sacks of flour, jars of lard, candles, and paper by the ream. She carried her parcels alone, walking the ridge road with her head down. One surviving deliveryman reported that the household never signed for their orders at the door. Packages were left on a low stump beside the path. Payment arrived later in an envelope of bills, folded into a single sheet of ledger paper. It was said that her father oversaw the accounts, even for goods intended for her. The handwriting on those envelopes matched the annotations in the birth records. There was a winter, midway through the decade, when the ridge was cut off by snow for nearly 6 weeks. A neighboring farmhand claimed to have seen smoke from the chimney each day without fail. Yet no tracks marked the road, and no one came to fetch water from the frozen creek. When thaw came, the first sign of activity was the delivery of a new high chair, its legs scored as if it had been fastened to the floor. A nurse at the county clinic, who had attended the birth of the 3rd child, later wrote in her resignation letter that the woman did not look into the mirror they placed for her. The nurse added no further detail, only that the infant's features aligned too closely with the 2 boys she had seen standing in the hallway. The letter was not addressed to the Boe, RD, but left in the drawer of her desk. It remained there until her office was cleared years later. The folder containing the birth records had no return address, no chain of custody. It was placed back into the box with the land deeds, as though its inclusion had been inevitable. In time, the cardboard sagged, the ink faded, and the story condensed into those faintly altered margins. Whether the changes were meant to conceal a mistake or to preserve an arrangement, the records did not say. And so the file waits, unclaimed, holding the kind of truth that is never written plainly, but always meant to be kept. The print is small, scarcely larger than a folded handkerchief, its surface mottled with the slow decay of silver salts. The emulsion has dulled to the flat grey of an overcast noon, yet the details remain intact. At its center sits a woman in a plain dress, her hands resting lightly in her lap, each finger angled as though the pose had been rehearsed. On either side stand 2 men, both taller than her by half a head, their shoulders squared toward the camera. The similarity of their features is immediate. The same narrow slope of forehead, the same high cheekbones, the same faint downturn at the corner of the mouth. It is the kind of resemblance that unsettles more than it reassures, a symmetry too complete to be accidental. Behind them, the wall is bare but for a single iron hook. Its placement is oddly high, positioned above the woman's head, where it would have caught the upper edge of a looking glass. Those familiar with the household claim there had been one, a rectangular mirror with beveled edges, a wedding gift given years earlier. Some recall it wrapped in brown paper and stored in the attic. Others insist it was taken down in a single night, the glass removed from its frame and carried to the creek. The photograph has no stamp from a studio. The edges are uneven, as though cut from a larger sheet. One archivist speculated it may have been developed in the home itself, in the same cellar where rainwater pooled in the cracks of the stone floor. The lighting in the image is strange. The figures are evenly illuminated, but no shadows touch the wall behind them. It gives the impression that they were standing closer than they should have, their bodies almost pressed against the plaster. There is a rigidity to their stance that suggests more than discomfort. The men's hands hang perfectly parallel at their sides, fingers extended, as though they had been instructed to keep them visible. The woman's posture is straighter than in later years, her chin held just high enough to keep the light from falling across her eyes. One who saw the original remarked that the irises seemed clouded, not with age, but with something inward-looking, as if she were measuring a thought too large to set down in words. This photograph surfaced during an inventory of seized property, long after the household itself was gone. It had been tucked between the pages of an accounts ledger, the paper slightly warped where the image had been pressed against it for decades. The ledger contained no entry for the picture, no mention of when it was taken or why. Only in the margin, beside an uncollected debt, was there a note in thin, slanting script, "Do not replace the glass." Those who examined the print in later years remarked upon the absence of any visible door or window in the background. The wall runs uninterrupted from edge to edge, leaving no sense of where the light originated. Some suspected the room had been closed for the photograph, sealed from drafts to prevent the plates from fogging. Others wondered if the omission had been intentional, part of a larger habit of removing reflective surfaces from the living spaces. The provenance of the photograph remains incomplete. No other images of the three together have been found, and no record of the photographer survives. The woman's dress, with its narrow collar and hand-finished cuff, could place it in the late 1870s or early 1880s, but the paper stock was not common to the region until a decade later. Archivists differ on whether this is evidence of a later reprint or a sign that the household had access to materials not locally available. In the end, the photograph tells less than it withholds. It offers a composition without context, a likeness without explanation. The missing mirror remains absent, its hook casting a faint, permanent shadow in the image, an absence that seems to draw the gaze, as though the reflection once there might have shown more than the room was willing to contain. The road narrowed long before it ended. The packed earth gave way to clay, its surface soft underfoot, holding the print of any who passed for days after. At the final bend, the ruts disappeared into weeds, and a single black mailbox leaned toward the ditch as though it had been trying to listen to something below. The paint on its side had peeled away in jagged strips, revealing bare metal, pitted with rust from years of rain. No number marked it, only a thin line where one might once have been painted and later scraped away. Beyond the turn, the land climbed in uneven ridges. Pine stands crowded the slope, their branches low and thick, locking together until no sky could be seen through them. The air held a muted weight, smelling faintly of damp paper and the acrid undertone of coal smoke, though no chimney was visible. The few who had reason to walk that stretch of road often spoke of the silence there, not the absence of noise, but a quiet that seemed to press back against the listener, flattening every sound before it could travel. County surveyors had mapped the route decades earlier, though their records were imprecise. The ridge settlement was drawn as a smudge of squares without scale, and the road itself was marked only until the stand of pines began. Beyond that point, the maps were blank. One surveyor's notation in the margin read simply, "Not maintained." Later accounts suggested the neglect was deliberate. Riders told of the clay turning slick after a rain, of wheels slipping sideways into the ditch, of a light mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. A postman who served the lower valley claimed he never went past the leaning mailbox. Parcels for the ridge were left there in a wooden crate with a hinged lid, its interior lined in waxed cloth. He said the crate was always emptied by the next morning, though he never saw who collected from it. On one occasion, he found a note inside, written in the same slanted, narrow hand seen on receipts from the household farther up. It read only, "No mirrors." The path past the mailbox was less a road than a seam in the land, barely wide enough for a cart. The clay gave way to loose shale, crunching underfoot, and the pines thickened until the trunks stood in a grid too regular to be natural. Those who reached this part often felt the air cool suddenly, as if the sun had been cut off entirely. Some described the sensation of being watched from between the trunks, though no movement was ever seen. The minister from a neighboring parish attempted to visit the ridge in the late spring of 1887, intending to deliver provisions after hearing reports of illness there. He returned before noon, carrying the provisions back with him, and did not speak of what had stopped him. His only note in the parish journal was a brief line: "Did not pass the trees." By the turn of the century, the road was omitted entirely from new county maps. Its absence was explained as a clerical correction, an error removed rather than a place erased. The leaning mailbox remained in place for years after, though no one could say who maintained it. Eventually, the weeds grew high enough to swallow it from sight. Those who search for it now find only an uneven rise in the clay and the faint metallic taste in the air, as if some heathing still burns far off where the pines stand locked together. The smell carries on certain days, low and steady, until it disappears again without warning, leaving only the stillness of a road that seems to end before it should. The birth register for the county was kept in a locked cabinet on the second floor of the courthouse, the key in the custody of the clerk whose duties rarely extended beyond the copying of deeds and the certification of marriages. The book itself was heavy enough to require both hands, its calfskin cover darkened with the oil of decades of handling. Inside, the ink had faded to brown, though the entries remained legible, written in the measured script of clerks trained before the war. What drew notice years later was not a single record, but the sequence as a whole. Beginning in the winter of 1861, the same surname appeared again and again, uninterrupted by the arrival of any new family to the ridge. Each generation followed without variation. Births to fathers of the same name, mothers whose maiden names were seldom recorded, and witnesses who signed with a consistent, unmistakable slant. The penmanship was distinctive, letters drawn tall and narrow, with the downward strokes pressed harder than the upward. Even in years when the clerk had changed, the witnesses' signatures remained identical, as if written by one hand over the span of 3 decades. Those who examined the register in later years remarked that the ink in these signatures seemed fresher than the surrounding text, the black still holding a faint sheen under lamplight. The role of witness in these births was always fulfilled by a member of the household, though never the same individual twice in succession. It gave the appearance of compliance, of a pattern designed to look varied while concealing the sameness beneath. The midwives who attended the births were all from the ridge, their names absent from other county records. One, who was Sauls, aide to have been the aunt to several of the mothers, signed her name in block capitals that sat apart from the slanted hand beside them, as though unwilling to match its form. In one column of the register, the space for place of birth alternated between home and ridge, terms so imprecise as to be meaningless. No specific addresses were given, no property boundaries noted. This vagueness persisted despite the county's increasing insistence on detail in the later decades of the century. It was as though the ridge existed outside the administrative reach of the town, a place acknowledged only enough to be recorded and then forgotten. A traveling physician, brought in for a confinement during the influenza outbreak of 1874, made his own copy of the birth entry for his records. In a note on the back, he remarked that the father and the witness bore an uncanny resemblance, their expressions mirroring one another's even when unobserved. He described the room as dim despite the open shutters, the air thick with the smell of boiled linen and coal soot. His entry ends with a remark that the infant's eyes seemed already to know the walls. By the final decade of the century, the sequence in the register had begun to tighten, shorter intervals between births, witnesses appearing in closer relation to the parents. One winter, 2 entries were made less than 6 months apart, both signed in that same slanted hand, the ink drying unevenly across the page. No formal inquiry was made into the repetition. The births were legal, the entries complete, and the register served its purpose as an official record. Yet the pages held a kind of insistence, as though the name itself was determined to overwrite all others, filling the book from spine to edge. The last entry in the sequence came in the autumn of 1891. The surname stood alone on the line, the mother's space left blank, the witness signature still perfectly slanted. The clerk who made the entry added no note and left no explanation. When the page was turned, the next line bore a different family entirely, as if the ridge had been cut from the record and replaced by something else. But the edges of the paper still showed a faint shadow of the name pressed through from the page above, a mark that could not be erased without destroying the book itself. The letter was written on thin, lined paper, the sort folded twice to fit in a pocket. The hand was small and deliberate, the strokes pressed deep enough to leave indentations on the sheet beneath. Its date placed it in the autumn of 1894, when the ridge had already acquired a quiet reputation for births that did not leave the property. The writer, a midwife known in the surrounding counties, had served the valley for over 20 years without incident. Her words in this case were brief, child's eyes clouded. Those who later saw the letter noted the absence of any further detail. No weight was given, no time of delivery, no mention of complications. It was the kind of omission that suggested something had been decided before the writing began. The paper smelled faintly of boiled cloth, and at its bottom corner was a faint smudge in the shape of a fingertip. The letter was handed to the clerk at the courthouse and entered into the stack awaiting transcription. 2 days later, it returned to the clerk's desk with a single word written across the top in heavy red ink: retracted. No explanation accompanied the retraction. The clerk's memory, recorded years afterward, was that the midwife had come in person, taken the letter from the stack, and stared at the lines as though they were unfamiliar to her. She was said to have held it for several minutes before setting it down again, her hand flat against the page, insisting it be struck from the record. The red ink was not hers. It belonged to the clerk, marking the document for removal. The midwife did not fuzz. Again in the county. She was not seen at the market, nor did her name appear in the parish rosters where she had once been a regular communicant. It was said she had taken to the next valley, where her work was limited to attending the births of women already known to her. In her absence, the ridge relied on its own, the same names appearing on birth records as both witness and attendant. A year after the withdrawal, a traveling physician visited the county during an outbreak of fever. He was told quietly that a child matching the midwife's description had been seen only once, carried in its mother's arms at the edge of the pine stand. The boy was said to have stared at the onlooker without blinking, the color of his eyes obscured by a pale film. No one could say where he was taken afterward. The physician's own notes contained a remark in the margin: absence of corneal reflection. Those who remembered the midwife spoke of her as careful, almost to a fault. She washed her hands between each touch, boiled her instruments twice, and insisted on sunlight in the room when possible. Her withdrawal from the ridge work was out of character, all the more so because she never spoke of it in the years that followed. A neighbor who saw her in her final winter described her as thinner, her eyes less steady, as though she kept them fixed on something behind the person speaking to her. The letter itself survived by accident. It had been placed in the wrong envelope when the clerk cleared his desk and ended up in a bundle of correspondence to be archived. There it remained, the red word bleeding faintly through the thin paper, the original line still visible beneath. Child's eyes clouded. Whether the phrase referred to illness, injury, or something not covered in the medical texts of the time was never determined. The paper has grown brittle, the indentations still visible if held at the right angle, as though the hand that wrote them had pressed too hard in the effort to make them last. The retraction stands over it like a seal, not erasing the words, but ensuring they will never be read without unease. The carrier's path through the valley took him past scattered farms, each with its own rhythm of gates and barking dogs, until the road thinned into the pale clay that led toward the ridge. The fence marking the property line was made of split rails, weathered to a silvery grey, leaning at angles that gave the impression of having shifted under their own weight. At its center, a narrow gap allowed for the exchange of parcels, though no visitor was known to pass through. Deliveries to the household followed a fixed pattern. A small wooden crate, lined in waxed cloth, was set just inside the fence. The carrier would place the packages inside, sacks of flour, sealed tins, paper-wrapped bundles, and turn back without waiting. By the next day, the crate would be empty. On rare occasions, the woman from the household would be present, standing behind the gap in the rails. She kept her head low, the brim of her bonnet shading her eyes, and accepted the parcels without looking directly at him. He noted in his own hand that she never spoke, only reached for what was offered and withdrew again. Her movements were precise, almost rehearsed, as though she had measured the space between the crate and the fence many times before. In winter, when the snow piled high against the rails, deliveries were left on a low stump at the bend in the path. The crate was not used then. The parcels would remain there until they vanished, leaving only the imprint of the paper in the crusted snow. Once, after a heavy storm, the carrier arrived to find the stump empty, though his previous delivery had been placed there less than an hour before. There were no footprints leading to it, no drag marks where a sled or sack might have been pulled. The surface of the snow was smooth except for the wind's ripples, yet the goods were gone. He made a note of the occurrence, not as complaint, but as an irregularity, the kind that might explain a missing item later. Over the years, the parcels grew heavier. More sacks, more sealed jars, more paper bundles wrapped tight with cord. He never saw anyone else carry them, yet the crate never lingered full. At times, faint tracks of ash or soot marked the rim of the crate, as though something hot had rested there before it was taken inside. The smell would linger faintly in the air, coal smoke, but sharper, tinged with something metallic. One autumn afternoon, while delivering a box of sewing notions, the carrier glanced past the fence and caught sight of the house at the end of the narrow path. Its shape was visible only for a moment between the trees. Two narrow windows at the front, their panes covered from within by a darker shade of cloth, and a roof that seemed too steep for its own proportions. The glimpse left him with the impression that the house leaned slightly, though he could not tell in which direction. After that, he found himself lingering less at the fence. In his later notes, he remarked that there was something about the silence of the property that unsettled him, how even the wind seemed to flatten before reaching the house. When the carrier retired, the route passed to another man, who was told only that the ridge deliveries were to be left at the stump in winter and at the crate in summer. No one explained why the packages were never to be carried farther up the path, or why the recipient's signature was never required. Years later, when the property stood empty, the crate remained inside the fence, its lining intact, the waxed cloth unstained. The stump at the bend was gone, rotted back into the ground. And still, on certain mornings, the air along that stretch carried the faint scent of coal smoke, as though something unseen had only just been taken in. The report was written in the same measured script used for livestock tallies and seized property, its tone without urgency, as though describing a place that had long since ceased to change. The list began with the number of beds, 8 of them, narrow and iron-framed, arranged in 2 rows along the walls of a single room. Their paint was flaking, the rails cold to the touch even in summer. Each bed held a thin, ticking mattress, the fabric worn smooth in the center and patched at the edges. The spacing between them was exact, as though marked on the floor in advance. Near the far wall, where a window might have let in light, stood a high chair fixed to the boards with 4 rusted bolts. The arms of the chair bore deep grooves, the varnish rubbed away in narrow channels by repeated pressure. The seat was slightly tilted forward, a detail that, once noticed, could not be ignored. In the report, this was noted only as secured to prevent movement. Every window in the house had been covered from within. Layers of coarse burlap, stiffened by age, had been nailed over the frames. Some of the cloth hung loose at the bottom where the nails had pulled away, but the effect was still one of complete occlusion. The sheriff wrote that the rooms were dim at midday, the air faintly sour from lack of circulation. No mirrors were found anywhere, not in the bedrooms, the washroom, or the narrow hall between. In the kitchen, shelves held rows of glass jars, pickled vegetables, preserved fruit, and a few containers of meat in gelatin, each labeled in the same slanted hand seen in other papers from the property. There were no utensils for more than a dozen, yet the bed suggested the capacity for more occupants than the current residents. A cast-iron stove sat cold, its flue patched with tin. The floor beneath it was scorched in a perfect circle. The upstairs room, if it could be called such, was reached by a steep stair that ended abruptly at a low door. The report described it as storage, though no inventory of its contents was made. The door was locked, the key not found. From beneath it came a faint draught, carrying the smell of dry paper and something else, metallic, almost medicinal. In the main room, the walls bore a curious pattern, faint lines etched into the plaster, parallel and evenly spaced, as though made by the edge of a ruler. On closer inspection, these lines were not level, but leaned inward toward a central point near the floor. No explanation was given in the report, though a later annotation suggested they might have been guides for hanging cloth or screens. One chair, set apart from the rest of the furnishings, had been placed against the wall opposite the high chair. Its seat was untouched by dust, unlike the others, as if someone had sat there recently despite the house being unoccupied when entered. On the floor beside it lay a single scrap of burlap, its weave loosened in the center where it had been pulled apart. The sheriff's account ended without conclusion, the final line noting only that the property was to remain sealed until further instruction. No such instruction was recorded. The key to the front door was kept in a desk drawer at the courthouse for several years until it was misplaced during renovations. What remained inside, the rows of narrow beds, the fixed high chair, the cloth-darkened windows, was left to the slow settling of dust. And yet, in later years, those who walked the ridge claimed to have seen a faint glow behind the nailed burlap, as though some small flame still burned within, steady and contained, refusing to die. The birth register for the winter of 1891 contained nothing unusual at first glance, rows of names, places, dates, until the entry from the ridge. The handwriting was the same even strokes as the other records that month, though the ink here was slightly darker, as if the pen had been freshly dipped for the occasion. The child's name was given plainly, the date precise, the attending officer's signature steady. But in the line for father, the name matched that of the household head, a man already recorded elsewhere in the ledger as parent to the mother herself. The clerk who transcribed the original certificate circled the line in pencil, the graphite faint against the brown paper, but took no further action. The mark remained in the margin, a quiet hesitation that neither corrected nor erased what had been written. Later recollections suggest the clerk had paused over the entry for some time, lifting his head toward the high courthouse windows before continuing with the next record. The certificate itself contained details beyond the norm. The birth took place on premises, with no midwife or physician other than the attending officer, whose name appeared on no other ridge entries before or after. The field for witness bore a signature in that familiar, narrow slant, the same hand seen across decades of ridge documents. Those who examined the paper years later remarked upon the absence of smudges or corrections, as though the form had been filled without hesitation. Only in the father's line did the composition falter, the ink pooling slightly at the downstroke of the surname's first letter. One archivist speculated the pen had paused there, hovering over the page before committing to the rest. Accounts from that winter placed the household in a state of withdrawal. Supplies were ordered in bulk at the end of autumn and not replenished until the thaw. The post was delivered to the crate at the fence, and no one was seen at market. A neighbor, tending to cattle in the low fields, reported hearing the rhythmic knock of metal on wood from the direction of the ridge, as though something were being fastened into place. The child from that record did not appear in the school rosters, nor in the parish baptism list. His existence beyond the ledger was traced only through a physician's note 2 years later, describing a boy brought in for treatment of a leg injury consistent with repeated strain. The physician remarked, without further comment, that the boy's features did not distinguish him from the older male in attendance. By the end of the decade, the household head's name vanished from public rolls, replaced by the slanted signature in property filings and receipts. No probate was recorded, no change in ownership declared. It was as if the roles had shifted without acknowledgement, each new record maintaining the internal order of the ridge while offering nothing to the outside. The certificate remained in its place for years, the penciled circle fading with time. When the register was rebound in the early 20th century, the margins were trimmed, and the mark disappeared entirely, leaving only the uncorrected entry. What lingered was the alignment of names, father and household head, pressed side by side in ink, without explanation or amendment. It is said that in certain light, when the page is tilted, the indentation of the pencil can still be felt beneath the printed word, a shallow groove that serves as the only trace of the moment someone hesitated, recognized the shape of what they were recording, and chose to let it stand. The baptism register for the spring of 1893 was a slim volume, its pages stiff with the chill of the stone vestry where it was kept. Most entries followed the familiar form: infant's name, date, parents, witnesses, recorded in the measured hand of the parish pastor. One entry made in late April broke that quiet uniformity. The child's parents were listed without correction, but in the space for witness stood a name already present elsewhere in the book, a boy recorded 2 decades earlier as the son of the household's patriarch. His age now placed him well beyond boyhood, yet he was marked here as uncle to the newborn. The handwriting for his name leaned steeply forward, the same narrow, deliberate strokes that had appeared in property deeds, supply receipts, and county birth records tied to the ridge. A faint tremor marked the first letter, as if the pen had paused before committing. Below the witness line, in the smallest script the page would hold, the pastor had left a note: "No outsiders present at ceremony." It was not a remark he used often. Those familiar with his habits said he preferred not to editorialize in official registers. The choice to make any note at all suggested unease, though no further explanation was given. The entry bore other irregularities. The location of the baptism was marked not as the parish church, but as on premises, a designation reserved for households too far to travel or for those where illness made the journey unsafe. The pastor's itinerary for that month contained no such exceptions elsewhere, and the ridge was within reach of the church in fair weather. The April day in question had been dry, with light wind, conditions that would not have prevented travel. Later accounts from those living near the ridge recalled no gathering, no procession toward the churchyard, no music from the chapel. The child was said to have been carried to the household's back room immediately after, wrapped so that no part of the face could be seen. One neighbor, returning from the mill, claimed to have glimpsed a small basin of water placed on a chair in the yard, its surface clouded, as though it had been poured and left standing for some time. The witness himself was rarely seen beyond the property. When he did appear, it was to collect goods from the crate at the fence or to move quietly between the shed and the house. In the few instances where he was observed at close range, his expression was described as fixed and inward, his eyes avoiding mirrors in shop window. Researchers, the register entry marked the last recorded visit of the pastor to the ridge. Whether by his choice or theirs, no further baptisms, weddings, or funerals from that household appeared in the parish books. The small margin note, "No outsiders present," became the final reference to their participation in church life. Years later, when the register was transferred to the county archive, the ink of the witness's signature had darkened against the fading page. The indentation left by his hand was still pronounced, cutting slightly into the paper where the pen had pressed hardest. The pastor's note, however, had begun to fade into the fibers, nearly illegible unless the light struck at the right angle. For those who study the register now, the alignment of names, the man marked as both brother and uncle, the child baptized without the presence of anyone beyond the household, remains fixed in place, as though the paper itself refuses to release it. And the basin of water, left standing in the yard that day, was never accounted for in the record, its purpose as unclear now as it was when first seen, shimmering faintly under the April sun before vanishing from view. The county nurse was assigned to the ridge as part of a seasonal circuit, her route sketched in pencil on the back of an envelope. She was to check on the household after reports of illness from a traveling merchant who had seen a pale child standing in the yard. The first visit was scheduled for late February, but the road that climbed toward the ridge had frozen into glassy ruts beneath a heavy crust of snow. She marked the form "unable to reach weather" and moved on to her other stops, expecting to return when the thaw began. A week later, the snow had receded into patchwork drifts along the fields. She walked the last stretch on foot, carrying her case and a small parcel of provisions in case the reports of sécheresses were true. The air was still, her steps muffled by the damp clay beneath. At the bend in the path, she saw the leaning mailbox and the crate, empty but for a dusting of frost. The house beyond was half concealed by the pine stand, its outline softened by the mist rising from the ground. When she reached the front step, there was no sound from within. She knocked once, then again, the hollow of the wood carrying the sound into the quiet. The third knock was followed by the faint scrape of something shifting beyond the door, too slow, too deliberate to be the wind. She waited, hand on the case, eyes adjusting to the dim shapes beyond the burlap-covered windows. After a minute, the sound ceased. The air felt heavier there, as though it had not been moved in some time. She stepped back to see if there was another entrance, but the side path was blocked by a stack of split rails, neatly tied and leaning against the wall. She circled once to the rear, where the ground sloped down to a small shed, its door locked with a strip of leather looped through a metal ring. Returning to the front, she tried the door, but the latch did not yield. There was no answer to her final knock. The only movement came from the cloth over the nearest window, which trembled once as though a hand had brushed against it from within. She stood for a long moment listening. Somewhere deeper in the house, a sound repeated at regular intervals, like wood striking wood, measured and unhurried. She recorded "no answer at door" in her notes, and closed the file when she returned to the clinic. The provisions remained in her satchel. She did not attempt the visit again. Others assigned to the route later said she avoided speaking of the ridge altogether, turning the conversation whenever it approached the subject. The file remained dormant for years, until an audit brought it to light. The notes were sparse, the handwriting growing smaller with each line, the last nearly pressed into the paper rather than written. The sound she had heard inside was not described in the official entry, only mentioned in a faint pencil notation on the back of the form, counted to 11, then began again. What had been counted, and by whom, was not explained. The house was abandoned by the time anyone returned with the intent to check, the windows still darkened, the rails stacked where she had seen them. The burlap had stiffened with time, yet in certain weather it was said to move again, slowly, as though something within still kept the measure. She came to the hospital on a wet afternoon, the sky low and colourless, carrying no bag, no escort, and offering a surname that matched no records in the county. The nurse at the desk recalled that her voice was even, each word spaced as though she had rehearsed them, but she gave no address, no next of kin. When pressed, she turned her gaze to the far wall, her expression unchanging. Her clothes were plain but immaculate, fabric worn soft from long use, hemline repaired more than once with a stitch that was too precise to be casual. There was no soil on her shoes, despite the road outside being churned into mud. She declined the offer to hang her shawl on the coat stand, holding it folded in her lap as she waited. The nurse's intake notes, written in a narrow hand, contained a single line apart from the basic measurements: avoids all reflective surfaces. It was not an observation made in passing. At each stage of the admission, the woman's eyes shifted away from the glass-fronted cabinets, the polished brass fixtures, even the small instrument mirrors used in examination. When a tray of sterilized tools was brought in, she angled her body so that none of them lay within her direct sight. She did not state the nature of her complaint, only that she needed to be seen. In the examining room, her pulse was steady, her temperature normal. The attending physician noted no injury, no sign of fever. He recorded a pallor inconsistent with other findings, and, after a moment's hesitation, added that she seemed to hold her breath whenever he stepped to her left, where a wall mirror hung between the cabinets. It was customary for new admissions to be given a basic wash and change into hospital linens. She refused both. The nurse wrote later that the refusal was not defiant but final, as if the matter had been settled long before the question was asked. When offered water in a tin cup, she drained it completely but placed it face down on the table so that its surface caught no light. The evening porter, passing through the ward, remarked that she sat upright in her bed without touching the headboard, her hands folded neatly on the blanket. She slept without turning, eyes closed but muscles faintly tense, as though bracing for some contact that never came. In the dim light, her breathing seemed to slow until it matched the ticking of the wall clock, the two sounds falling into the same rhythm. By morning, she was gone. The bed was made, the sheets smooth as though no one had lain there. The borrowed linens she had worn were folded with exact symmetry and left at the foot of the bed. There was no record of her discharge, no witness to her leaving. The porter, who checked the door logs later that day, found that the ward's exit had not been opened during the night. The alias she had given was searched in surrounding counties, but matched no family, no property deed, no birth registry. The nurse kept her intake card at the back of the file, the single line about reflective surfaces standing out against the otherwise routine entry. Months later, a surgical orderly cleaning the examination room noticed that the wall mirror beside the cabinet was missing its original glass. In its place was a sheet of burlap stretched tight within the frame, the edges held by nails driven in flush. No one claimed to have made the change. The burlap remained, unmoved, its weave faintly warped in the center, as though something behind it had once pressed forward and then drawn back. The hearing was held in the smallest of the courthouse's meeting rooms, a narrow space lined with shelves of unused law books whose spines had faded to the same dull shade of brown. The air smelled faintly of dust and the varnish from the long table that dominated the center. A clerk had set up the cylinder recorder at one end, its brass fittings polished, the turning key wound tight. The two men, father and son, sat side by side on the far side of the table. Their postures mirrored one another exactly, hands folded, shoulders slightly inclined forward. The resemblance between them was sharper than the official photographs had suggested. It was in the slope of the brow, the line of the jaw, the faint asymmetry in the eyes that made it difficult to tell their ages apart. The questions were delivered evenly, as though recited from a prepared list. Each one met with the same answer, spoken in identical cadence. There was nothing wrong. The words were not hurried, not defensive, simply placed into the air and left to settle. Between each exchange, the recorder clicked steadily, capturing the silence in long, unbroken stretches. Observers noted that neither man looked toward the door or the windows during the proceedings. Their attention remained fixed on the table's surface, as though reading from some invisible text laid out between them. The only movement came when they adjusted their hands in unison, fingers unfolding and refolding, the gesture precise enough to seem deliberate. The clerk in attendance later recalled that the son spoke with an inflection that matched the father's exactly, down to the slight downward shift in tone at the end of each sentence. It gave the impression not of two people answering separately, but of a single thought passing through two voices. At one point, the question shifted to the presence of children in the household. The recorder captured a brief pause before the answer came, the sound of the cylinder's mechanism turning without interruption. The words, when they arrived, were the same. Nothing wrong. The pause lasted only a breath, but it was the first and only hesitation in the entire exchange. Those in the room remarked afterward on the temperature. The hearing took place in midsummer, yet the air inside remained cool to the point of discomfort, as though the walls held back more than the sound. The curtains were drawn, but a thin seam of light pressed through at one corner, falling in a narrow line across the table. Neither man moved to shield his eyes from it, though the light lay directly across their faces. The hearing concluded without recommendation. The recorder was stopped, the notes gathered, the men excused. They rose at the same time and left the room without looking back. The sound of their steps in the corridor was indistinguishable from one another, as if their weight fell in perfect sequence. The cylinder was placed in the courthouse archive, labeled with the date and the words, "Ridge Matter, No Action." When it was played years later during a review of old cases, listeners remarked that the faint background hum between answers was not consistent with the machine's usual noise. It seemed to carry a pattern, almost like the measured knock of wood against wood, repeating at regular intervals beneath the silence. No one could say whether the sound had been present in the room or was an artifact of the recording itself. The original cylinder remains in storage, its surface slightly warped with age, the clicking pauses intact, holding the measured rhythm of two voices, answering together, leaving nothing but absence in the spaces between. The fire began without warning on a still evening in late April. The air was clear, the ground damp from a recent rain, yet by the time the first thin column of smoke was seen from the valley road, the flames were already moving through the center of the house. Those who watched from a distance later remarked that the blaze seemed to work inward and upward at once, as though it had begun at multiple points deep within the structure. No call for help was ever made. The ridge had no telephone line, and no messenger came down the road. The sheriff, arriving with 2 deputies after sunset, found the fire at its height, but without the usual sound of a house in its final collapse. The flames moved steadily, but without the frantic gusts of wind-fed combustion. It was as if the building was allowing itself to be undone in a measured way, each section giving way only after the one beside it had burned to completion. The windows, still covered in burlap, caught fire first from the inside. The fabric flared bright for a moment, then collapsed into blackened scraps that clung to the frames. The doors remained closed throughout, their edges outlined in faint red where heat pressed against the iron hinges. The roof did not fall until the very end, when the interior had already been reduced to a bed of embers. No voices were heard inside. The deputies circled the property, keeping back from the heat, but found no sign of anyone leaving. There were no footprints in the damp ground beyond the fence, no wheel ruts on the narrow clay road. The crate used for deliveries sat empty, a light coating of ash beginning to settle in its corners. When the fire finally consumed itself, the remains of the house stood low against the ridge, blackened beams, collapsed rafters, the brick of the chimney fractured by the heat. The sheriff's log noted the absence of any attempt to rebuild, the land left as it was. The property was never claimed, never sold, and in time the ground where the house had stood became choked with sumac and thorn. In the weeks after, the only items recovered were found near the center of the ruin. The rusted bolts of what had once secured a high chair, warped lengths of iron bed frame, and a small section of wall where the burlap had burned, but left behind a pattern in the plaster. The pattern was a series of narrow lines, each leaning toward a central point at floor level, darkened now by smoke and soot. No one could say if the marks had been made before or during the fire. The most curious detail came from the physician who examined the site days later. Beneath the ash, he found that the wooden floorboards in one section had burned from below, the charring deeper on their underside than on the surface. He remarked that this was unusual given the construction of the house and the lack of any open space beneath that portion of floor. His observation was not included in the official summary, which listed the cause simply as unknown, no evidence of foul play. In the years that followed, the ridge road fell further into disuse. Travelers avoided the turn where the mailbox once leaned, claiming that in certain seasons the air along that stretch carried a faint, dry heat, though no fire had burned there since. On still evenings, when the last light of the sun cut low across the valley, a thin thread of smoke could sometimes be seen rising from the pines, dissipating before it reached the open sky. It was found in what had once been the center of the house, where the beams had fallen inward and the ash lay deepest. The cover was warped, its leather blackened along one edge, the stitching on the spine pulled loose from the heat. When lifted, it released the faint odor of charred cloth and something sharper. Ink burned just enough to leave a metallic tang. The pages were brittle at their margins, yet the writing inside had survived. It was not immediately readable. Each line ran in reverse, the letters mirrored so that they appeared as a dense, unbroken code. Only when a fragment was held to the polished back of a shovel did the words reveal themselves, letter by letter, as though they had been written for an audience that could never face the page dire. Exactly. The first entries were brief, lists of names, none accompanied by dates, each written with the same steady hand. The order was not chronological. Instead, the names appeared and reappeared as if rewritten to preserve them. In the margins, small marks were made, tiny circles and diagonal lines that bore no obvious relation to the text. As the pages went on, the writing lengthened into sentences, some underlined twice in red ink. They read as instructions more than reflections. References to the loop and the fold recurred, but the language avoided specifics, as if the meaning was not to be shared with those outside the household. In 3 separate entries, the same phrase was copied across the entire page. Loop, not spread. The repetition was precise. Each instance of the phrase was aligned perfectly with the one before, the letters spaced with a ruler's consistency. Even the smudges of ink fell in the same places, as though the page had been traced from an earlier original. Near the center of the book, the handwriting tightened, the lines crowding together until they nearly overlapped. Here the instructions grew more exact, describing the placement of beds in a room, the covering of glass with cloth, and the removal of reflective speech from conversation. One passage, partially obscured by a burn, spoke of keeping the line close so that it knows itself. The last pages were the most damaged, their edges crumbling at the touch. The ink here had bled into the paper from the heat, the letters blurred but still legible in the mirror. The phrase, loop, not spread, appeared again, this time alone on the page, written larger than before. Underneath, faint but visible, were 2 parallel lines drawn in charcoal, converging toward a point that had been rubbed away. No name appeared anywhere in the journal, no indication of who had written it or for whom it was intended. The absence of personal detail gave the text an unyielding quality, as though it belonged to the house itself rather than any one person. Those who handled it after its discovery remarked on the way the book resisted opening fully, the half-burned edge holding the pages in a permanent arc. It was kept for a time in the county archive, stored away from light, until someone, perhaps an archivist, perhaps a visitor, removed it from its box and failed to return it. The ledger of holdings listed it as missing the following winter. Its whereabouts remain unknown. Yet there are accounts from the valley of a mirror in an abandoned outbuilding, its surface tarnished but intact, where the faint reflection of reversed handwriting can still be seen if one stands close enough. The words are partial, the glass too clouded to read them all, but one phrase is always visible, centered in the dim light: loop, not spread. The box was returned to the archive on a day without ceremony. Its lid sat unevenly, the cardboard softened at the corners from years of handling. Inside, the folders had shifted in transit, their edges feathered from repeated turning, the paper beneath marked with the pale ghosts of long-faded pencil lines. The clerk who carried it to the upper shelves did not linger. He slid it into its place between 2 volumes of tax assessments, turned the key in the cabinet, and wrote nothing more. No new pages were added. The file remained as it had been left. Birth records with their faint erasures, the circled line naming a father twice, the baptism entry with its marginal note, the midwife's letter stamped, retracted, the sheriff's list of furniture reduced to bare fact. Even the journal, half-burned and already catalogued as missing, still had its space in the inventory, a blank line where its description should have been. Over the years, the paper took on the slow discoloration of neglect. The ink paled in some places, deepened in others, as if the documents themselves were deciding what would remain legible. The photograph, stored in its own thin sleeve, kept its sharpness longer than expected. The 3 faces, arranged in their stiff composition, looked out with an unchanging clarity, their resemblance fixed. Behind them, the iron hook still held its place above the absent mirror, the shadow it cast growing no softer with time. The road to the ridge was left to itself. The weeds overtook the clay, the ruts filled with standing water each spring. The leaning mailbox rusted through at its base and fell into the ditch. The crate used for deliveries rotted in place, the waxed lining stiff and cracked. By the 2nd decade of the new century, the path beyond the pines was impassable, the house's stone foundation hidden beneath bramble and thorn. From the courthouse window, there was no longer any sign of smoke rising from that direction. The ridge became a shape on the horizon only in certain light, when the sun sank low enough to catch the edge of its tree line. The absence did not erase it entirely, it simply removed it from the rhythm of the county's daily record. On rare occasions, someone seeking old family connections would request to see the box. The clerk, never the same one from year to year, would bring it down, set it on the table, and leave the researcher alone with its contents. Each reported the same thing. The air inside the sleeve of the photograph was faintly warmer than the room around it, as though it had been held only moments before. None stayed with the image for long. The last recorded handling of the file took place in late autumn, when an archivist attempted to rebind its loosening covers. In the process, a thin slip of paper was found at the bottom of the box, its edges scorched. The writing on it was reversed, visible only when held up to the glass of a cabinet door. The words were incomplete, the final letters missing, but the phrase was still legible enough to be recognized by those who knew the rest. The slip was placed back into the box without notation, the lid returned to its uneven seat. Somewhere above the courthouse's quiet upper floor, the shelves settled in the cooling air. And in the photograph, the 3 figures remained at their post, the empty hook behind them still waiting for something no one would now bring to hang. If you want more undiscovered documentaries like this, coming where you're tuning in from, and subscribe so the next chapter reaches you.